As I roved out one bright May morning to view the meadows and flowers gay, whom should I spy but my own true lover, as she sat under yon willow tree. I took off my hat and I did salute her. I did salute her most courageously.
Good evening. Welcome to the Dingle Literary Festival online. My name is Carlo Gébler, and this evening I'm going to be talking to Sara Baume. Now, in the interests of glasnost, I must explain. I have met Sara Baume. I know Sara Baume. I met her when she was a student in the Oscar Wilde Centre for Irish Writing in Trinity, and I was a teacher there. After she left, Sara left the Oscar Wilde Centre. She published a novel. I'm sort of going to hold it up. I don't know if anyone can see it. Spill Simmer Falter Wither. And this novel was awarded the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, which is a prize for promise. Again, in the interest of glasnost, I need to explain I was on the committee that awarded this prize. And the decision to award the prize was one that I endorsed 110%. This is a brilliant novel. After this novel, Spill Simmer Falter Wither, Sara wrote A Line Made by Walking, which I've also read. The title is from Richard North, the sculptor. Yes. Richard Long, I beg your pardon. This is marvelous. We didn't read this. I don't think it was published when the Rooney Prize was awarded. I might be wrong, but no, it wasn't. The Rooney Prize is for promise, and I'm delighted that our recognition, our sort of promise detector, our promise radar was absolutely, in this case, 100% correct. Most recently, Sara has published this, Handiwork. This is a marvelous book, very fluent and compressed, and an extraordinary amalgam of memoir, family genealogical history, nature writing, description of artistic practice and the business of what it is to make, revelation of how a maker, a writer, and an artist organizes themselves in time and space, and a work of philosophy. And I thought I'd start off. The book is an account of making a flock of birds after the death of Sara's father. And there are many wonderful things in it, but I was struck by a line. I love materiality, but I hate materialism. And I thought to myself, yes, I'm right with you. So let's go straight to materiality. This flock of birds that you made, what did you make them out of? How did you display them? How did you paint them? How did you make them? Tell us, because they are the spine of the book.
Mm. Well, hello, Carlo, and
Hello.
and everyone watching, if there's anyone watching. I should begin by saying that it's such a pleasure to be doing an event with you, because
Thank you.
You were one of my tutors in college, brief though it may have been. I mean, it was a year-long course.
Mm-hmm.
It was a master's. It was an MPhil. Never quite sure why it was
was
called
an MPhil.
In creative writing, and Carlo was one of a number of tutors. You weren't sort of like one of my main ones as far as I remember, but you were a weekly endeavor. and we had I like, there are things that, it's funny because you talk about me publishing a novel after I finished the creative writing masters, but it was actually 5 years after I finished the creative writing masters that I published Spill Simmer, and that was a crucial period. And I'm never quite sure how I feel about how the masters played a role in sort of forming me as a writer. I was very, very new to writing when I did it. I'd been writing critical art reviews, writing about visual art essentially, and from that I had to learn how to write fiction. But I always remember, I don't remember much from the masters, I'll be honest. I remember that Richard Ford did a series of workshops and that he wore brightly colored socks. Random things like that. But I remember you telling us about, it's one of the very particular details that I've regurgitated to people over the years, but I remember you saying that when you write a character, you have to know absolutely everything about the character. You have to know what they ate for breakfast, know who their second cousin twice removed was. And at the time, I found that crippling. And I think I thought that it literally meant you have to describe all that. Whereas, of course, what you meant and what it took me the 5 subsequent years to sort of process and figure out was that you have to know the character so well that all of these small details of their day and of their past have a bearing on what they do in the novel. So you don't have to mention those things, but you have to know them for yourself.
Mm.
And in a way, it was crippling because in Spill Simmer, I pared my cast back to a skeleton cast. Really, I just had a few people in it, and I thought, because it's too much information to take on, I'll just have a couple of characters. And then after Spill Simmer, you know, my 2 books since have been very autobiographical, and so I felt sort of on steady ground, on steady terrain with writing about people I know and or an extreme version of people I know, or sort of slightly fictionalizing people I know. And then Handiwork, of course, is the pinnacle of that, in the sense that it's not untrue at all, and at no point am I pretending that it's untrue. It's my first work of nonfiction. So sorry, the question was about the birds. Do you want to chime back in on that?
Oh yes, I remember our classes very, very well. One of the things that I always do with the class, because of my incipient dementia, is that I always make everybody sit in exactly the same place every week, and I don't allow people to move. I ask them not to move, and I explain that I do that because then everything that the person who's sitting in front of me says will be collected. I will associate them and their discourse with that space. And your space was directly in front of me. Absolutely, you were the person I would eyeball the most. And I remember you learn a lot from the position that a person chooses to place themselves in a space. And we had long conversations in the class about chronology, about the first, you talked about the relationship, organizing narrative in space that came from your fine art and sculptural experience. And then you talked a great deal about the translation of that into a narrative form, because, of course, in a narrative form, it takes hours. You can look at a painting or you can look at a sculpture 4 hours, but you can face it and imbibe it in a fraction of a second. Whereas, you know, Madame Bovary is going to take you 10 hours or a lifetime. And that was really, really interesting, those discussions about chronology. and it's something that I found. Anyway, I remember those conversations with pleasure, and I remember really, really having. You were delightful. You were delightful. Never obstructive. Always open. Always open. But I think that came from having been at art school. So that you.
Well, I'd say this is a means of.
You'd already.
Sorry, I missed.
You'd already had at art school the experience, which you touch upon in Handiwork. You'd had people saying to you, "Why are you doing this?" So you were familiar with that kind of interrogation.
Yeah, that was a big part of art school. I mean, we would literally have to stand up every couple of weeks and present where you were with your project to the class, and then they would kick holes in it. Largely they would question all of your decision making, and I think that's why I'm unfair to the masters in creative writing, because I feel that I was formed a lot more by art school and by the structure of that, and that the masters kind of got me reading and taught me a lot about what I should be reading and what my peers were doing. And it was really useful to have that kind of workshop environment. But I still now, I mean, because it's like 10 years on, Carlo, it was 2009, 2010, I did that master's. So it was 10 years ago. And now I kind of find myself talking about art school and omitting to mention that I did a creative writing master's, which is kind of disingenuous.
But the other thing was that the way in which you deploy and marshal language, which is very lucid and precise, was already present. There's reading any of these and thinking about the person I met in the first floor seminar room in the Oscar Wilde Centre, the distance in prose terms between that person and this person in front of me now is negligible. They are the same. You're just doing what you've become what you always were, only more so.
But I eventually learned economy of language, which was something else that I strongly remember you teaching us. That, in spite of the fact that we had to know all of these things about our characters, we had to find a way of condensing it and keeping it sharp, which took me years to learn. I don't think anyone can learn that quickly. I mean this as a kind of I mean this in consolation to anyone who perhaps wants to do a creative writing master's and hasn't gotten into the course, but I got into the course on a second round, so I barely even got into the Oscar Wilde masters, and then when I didn't finish it with the first class honors at all, and then it took me 5 years to write a novel, so I never felt that I was top of that class at all, and really it was just one foundation block in many, like, to be honest, the 5 years after, in which I was on the dole, and we were in the recession that kind of went from sort of 2011 onwards, or 2008 onwards, that was probably more formative. Loads of despair, loads of existential despair was what got the novel written in the end.
I started off by asking you about the flock. Tell me, what did you make the flock out of?
Well, I have to admit that it's a very fair mistake to make, but the flock was not what I was making, what I described making in the book. That the birds, there's actually only about 20 of them, and I made them as an afterthought. I made them because Lisa Cohen of Tramp Press, my editor, said, I would love to know what this little bird, the northern wheatear, looks like, because the wheatear is a kind of a motif in the book. It's something that the book starts with, and then it comes back at the end. And I thought, okay, well, I can't draw it because I'm terrible at drawing, and I can't take a photograph of it because I just they're hard to find and even harder to photograph. So I thought I'll make them, because sculpture was what I studied in college, and I'm much better with my hands making things than with drawing or painting. So then I made every bird, a bird for every chapter. Every bird that appeared in the book I then made out of carved plaster. and put them on sticks, because that was sort of reminiscent of how birds appear in model railways. They tend to be on sticks or sitting on lines or rocks or ponds or something. So the series of works that I was actually making, that I was describing making in the book, were small sort of house-like structures, cottage-like structures, again out of carved plaster. But what I realized when the book was published was that it wasn't at all explicit that I wasn't making the birds, that everyone took it to be an account of my carving the birds, and that's fine, I suppose. I couldn't fault that interpretation, because but it taught me a lot about how little you understand of your own work, really, because you're so close to it, and because you understand it so fully. It's like the way we don't really see sentences. We kind of have a rough sense of what the sentence says, so we just sub in the words that we know should be there.
Yes, because you talk about you coming out in the evening after your father's death, and you watch a swallow, and the book beautifully connects your. Well, the book is an attempt to come to terms through activity with an absence. And you describe the activities, the making. Did it work? Did all this fabrication help you?
Interestingly, Carlo, when I'm writing a book, and I think especially a book like this, I'm not one of those writers who can't read anything that's vaguely similar to it in case it sort of taints what they're writing. I try and read things that are similar as a way of inspiring myself, I suppose. And I wrote a lot of stuff, or I read a lot of stuff for this one about the history of amateur craft and about the arts and crafts movement and William Morris. And on the theme of fathers, the book that I read was Father and I, your 2001 memoir, I suppose. But what I loved about it was that it took, what was fascinating about it to me was that it takes only the parts of a life in which you remember your father, in which you have a strong memory of your father, and then goes through life essentially in those episodes. And in a way, I was upset by it, because I felt that if I was to do the same thing, I would not have that much. That even though my father was a lovely man, like a kind man, he wasn't a strong presence in my childhood, and then he became more of a strong presence, I guess, when I was a teen, and when I wanted to do arty things and he didn't get it, and objected, and we clashed essentially. And then finally in my 20s, when I started making things, when I started making sculpture or contemporary art in college, he became very useful to me, because he could make things move, he could weld things, he could source me scrap materials. And then eventually we became good friends, and used to have a pint together, in his latter years. But it took me, so initially when he was dying, I think I thought I didn't want to be upset. And so I was very pragmatic about it. And I thought, I'm not going to miss him much, because he's not a strong presence in my life. And I think initially I didn't. And it was only as the years went by, and all of those small things sort of accumulated, that I saw the larger loss. And I still, all the time now, because I'm doing more sculpture now, and I'm starting to do residencies and stuff, and all the time I think, oh God, Dad would know how to do that. Like, this is a really boring practical thing, but every time the van breaks down, I miss him, because I know that he could fix it easily, or at least tell us what was probably wrong with it. And I feel the loss in that way. And I felt bad initially that I didn't have this sort of huge grief that a daughter should have. But then it was a slower thing. And in a way, I suppose working with my hands has kept him alive for me. But then at the same time, it sort of makes me miss him more, because he's more present to me when I'm making something and getting it wrong.
You talk about someone who pumped your hand at the wake and who reminded you that it would take a long time. They say it'll be a long time before it hits you. They're on this person must maybe was somebody that your father worked with, were prescient, because this is another thing. I mean, handiwork is it's very specific and very compressed in the best sense, but it's a book about many things, but it's a book about the way in which time works. It's a book about the importance of making use of your time, and you talk a lot about your you don't like to waste time, but also it's about how you in time change. That's a very interesting thing. So you talk about your grandfather and your father and you, and what you thought about your grandfather and your father, and then how you subsequently, over time, changed. And not many texts engage with duration and alteration. And that's one of the things that makes the book so interesting. You really are, when you read it, you really do feel as if you've gone, to use the modern term, you've really gone on a journey. Not a word I use very often, but you know what I mean. You really feel, oh yeah, I get this. It's also quietly political. Why do you hate materialism?
It's quietly anti-capitalist.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Yeah.
And
well, that's political.
And and the whole issue of materialism was sort of strong in my mind, I suppose. Then I guess I'm getting to a stage in my life now where I worry a lot about climate change, but I don't want to sort of jump on the bandwagon of writing about climate change directly. So I feel that it sort of impacts my life in all these other ways. And so, but what was interesting about reading about the arts and crafts movement, and how strongly William Morris felt that how strongly he was sort of kicking against the industrialism, the Industrial Revolution in the UK then, and I kind of I identified with that a lot. I kind of felt like we're going through that again in the digital age, and that there needs to be this sort of movement for just bringing it back to things being well made, and it's in there somewhere. But for Morris, it was about the humanity of an object, and it was about the person who'd made it, the labor, the hours that they put into it, and the strength of that kind of coming through. And I just feel that we've lost that so completely. And in my own small way, even though the things that I make are inherently wasteful, it's kind of like it's a ritual that sort of tries to preserve that. I feel a lot of the time as well that I'm trying to compensate for the absence of religion in my life, and it's so by making these things and making them well is partly maybe a political gesture, a sort of kick against capitalism, but also sort of a way of praying. I've thought about that a lot during lockdown because there's so much time and I'm doing so many sort of pointless things, but I'm sort of doing them in order to cope. So I mean, there's lots of things. It's funny, like lockdown this year would have perhaps made Handiwork a different book, or it's sort of taken on a different relevance in my life. But yeah, I'm kind of rambling a bit.
No, what sort of things are you doing during lockdown? How are you passing your time?
Oh, I'm spending more time working with my hands. It's funny, that's something that came up because I was just reminding myself recently, and Father and I, and something that you felt that divided you from your father was that he had a flair for working with his hands. He wanted to touch things and make things, whereas you didn't. You much more wanted to sit and think. And I would definitely be in the camp of wanting to, and with my own father as well, with needing to distract myself with my hands. That to sit down with my mind is actually sort of makes things worse in a way. That if I'm using my hands, then I'm much more content and absorbed. than if I was engaged in academic endeavors. Do you still feel that? I wonder, because a long time has passed since you wrote that book.
Yeah, I mean, well, reading Handiwork, I was very excited to come across William Morris, because of course William Morris was one of my father's heroes. I don't think he thought William Morris was left-wing enough. You know, Lenin was the person he emulated and admired in that respect, but he loved Morris. His ability to do things was really, I mean, he should have really been an engineer. Well, he could have been an engineer or something. I mean, he loved to make things. And I have, when he got Alzheimer's, I cleared his house, and all the bits of furniture and the lamps, all the stuff I took had been altered, chipped, cut, finagled, fixed. Everything has had something done to it in order to make it work better or fit into a room. It's very interesting. So I'm surrounded by all this furniture, because it's in the house where I live now, which has got all his marks. Your question was what? Well, the last thing I was going to say is, personally, I now have a son who's at art school making sculpture, and we have a little workshop at home which we've made, and we bought him a drill and a vise, and it's quite extraordinary. I look at him and I think I'm looking at my father at the age of 18, because he has this incredible capacity for fabricating and bending and sewing, and that's just the way he thinks through things. But you are bifurcated, because you have the ability to think through things and to think through language, which is a gift very few people have. And quite frankly, many people who do two different things, one of the two different things they do is terrible. I mean, I was recently teaching D.H. Lawrence, and I looked up D.H. Lawrence's paintings. In my opinion, I hope I'm not offending anyone, they're beyond bad. They are like appalling. But from this, I can tell, and from you can make things of great beauty and write beautifully as well. That's a rare gift. The other thing is, which the book talks about, is your ability to organize yourself in time and in space. So a lot of this book is about, I write at this time, and here is where I write, and I fabricate over here, and I paint over here, and I saw over here. In lockdown, have you maintained that discipline of dividing your day up, doing 4 hours here of this, 2 hours of that there, and so
on? Yeah, it's funny. Sorry, I have to refer back to what you were saying about your dad and then your son, because I feel a bit like with my grandfather, it's sort of repeated in me what my grandfather was doing, because, and I mean, this is kind of what Handiwork talks about, really, but what my dad did was very practical. He was building heavy duty machinery, and it never would have occurred to him to come inside and make something. Like, I was fascinated that my mother said he had a few books about wrought iron, and this was something he talked about doing possibly when he retired. Now, it was still, all about sort of fire and quite not, but it was essentially decorative. Wrought iron is sort of twisting and prettiness. But I felt that it had repeated, the gene had sort of repeated in me from my grandfather, who made these terribly elaborate horse carts that were simply, well, they were a means of I think remembering his past, but they were decorative. Like, there was absolutely nothing functional about them. So it's interesting that perhaps the genes skip a generation and come back out again.
The horse carts that your grandfather made were not kits. They weren't made from a kit. He would have a book with a plan, and then he had to personally fabricate, manufacture in his attic in Thirsk, I think. Is that where he lived? In Yorkshire? He had to fabricate every single spindle for the wheel. He had to make it and sand it. And I mean, yes, you've inherited that.
for years I thought he made them himself, and I was kind of pissed when I realized that it wasn't a kit, but he'd followed a plan, so he hadn't designed them himself. And that, as an art student, was disappointing to me because I feel like I have this it's funny you say, is your son doing fine art as opposed to craft?
He's doing sculpture lens technically, so he's able to do both.
Because I felt very much like I studied fine art, but it was very much geared towards conceptual art. And I studied in IADT Dunleary, so it was the film school, and it was very much kind of about 4D, about new media. And now I kind of feel like my inner crafts person was confused and went to art school. And actually, I left art school with lots of ideas and the ability to write about my concepts, but not with any practical skills. And I'm still sort of compensating for that. All these years later, I have no good skills, so I just find myself putting a lot of effort into handicraft. So I can build things, but I'm not following any particular craft, and so I feel kind of impoverished by that, in a way. But then it wasn't a million miles away from what my grandfather was doing. Sorry, what was the question? I've completely gone off.
I was just observing that you have become you replicate your grandfather's interests. That was how this began. But let's go back to something we touched on earlier. You made this book out of absence, out of recognition of absence. What did for you the making and completing of this book achieve?
I never really thought that it would be a book, and it was only because it sort of got too long to be an essay, and because I have a very nice, loyal publishers, I thought, maybe they'll publish it for me. And then for me, it's very important to have a visual element, I suppose. So the making of the birds and that kind of overall concept was, I think more than anything, I wanted to kind of reclaim some territory as a maker. I felt like I was spending an awful lot of time, like most of each day, far more time than I spend reading or writing, making things, working with my hands, and I wanted to justify that in some way. And I thought, as twisted as it seems, if I write a book about it, then I'll have justified it. I'll have at least articulated to myself why I feel this insistence to work with my hands. I mean, Carlo, like I worry all the time that I really shouldn't have been a writer, and I don't know how I ended up here, and that it's all just sort of it's an elaborate way to sort of get back into making art and giving myself permission for that. So I kind of worry about that all the time. I think, how did I end up writing books? How? But now it's like writing books or writing things is actually my income. So I've backed myself into a corner. It's that awful.
Well, perhaps the answer to the question why is, well, it was inevitable. Maybe just the way that you are and the way your psyche is configured, it was just what was going to be. But it is very puzzling when one looks at one's life. I mean, why anything? It's a complete mystery. I mean, if I went back to my 20-year-old self and said how things were going to turn out, he wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah.
I thought my life was going to, go in a completely different direction to the one that it's ended up going in. We should also, just mention to people who haven't read Handiwork, the way in which it's organized. So sometimes you'll have a page which will be full of text. Sometimes there'll be an aphoristic epithet. It's absolutely incredibly well organized so that you're delivered these pieces of perfect, symmetrically perfect prose of varying lengths, which just, they just go down like a glass of champagne switch page, another glass of champagne. You're, intoxicated with delight by the time you get to the end. That's also really, that's a sign of real literary heft. It's not just a question of organizing the language. Of course you must, but it's also the sequencing and the way you move and weave. So you will talk about Oberdon, the American watercolorist who painted birds in America, and then you'll talk about your father, and then you'll talk about something you've seen, and you keep altering your focus, but everything is connected. So you've got all these little tiny articulating bits, which then, when they come together, make something that's greater than the, something that's greater than the sum of its parts.
And I mean, that's just, I suppose, sort of learning from how we read and what we read, which is something vital that I did learn from my master's, and sort of adjusting your own writing to that. I like there to be lots of gaps and white space, or the way we've read and understand things changes. It's in the same spirit that you rewrite Aesop's fables or Decameron stories, or you're sort of tuning into how people read and how people understand things, and adjusting for that.
Now you've
sorry, you asked me earlier about time, and I meant to say, I mean, lockdown has been difficult only in the sense that I mean, my days are the same in that you organize things, and that's, I think, how any artist and writer, any self-employed person has to exist. They sort of divide their day into parcels of things, and try to keep to them. But that's been harder in a pandemic because it's like there's no deadline. There's never any particular, there's never any outlet at the end, in a way. So it's been harder to keep doing that with no end in sight.
But you do have a very, very strong, you don't like to waste time, and you're very conscious of the, if time is wasted, you don't like the feeling that you have to endure as a result of that. And I think that's, I read that and I think, oh yeah, I absolutely understand that. Yeah.
And yet I think if some busy person with like a real job and children were to look at my life, they'd call it all a waste of time.
I don't think so. I really don't. Somebody has
Someone
sent
who
me
cleans their house, for example.
Somebody, Anne with an E, has a question relating to the COVID lockdowns. This is what she says. I love that you pursue both art and writing, as we've been discussing. I think this time is a time for reclaiming our relationship with hands and the body. It's necessary if we're to save the planet. How do you see your work linked to moving back to the soil of life? That's the question. How do you see your work linked to moving back to the soil of life?
Well, I'll give you like a really trite answer. But during the summer, as a response to the year that was the pandemic, I thought, well, I'm not going to go anywhere this year. There will be no holidays. And the souvenir is something I'm obsessed with anyway, from a kind of from the point of view of the souvenir as an object, or the sort of symbolism of the souvenir. So throughout the summer, probably starting around April, I made 100 souvenirs of my house. So they were kind of styled on the Irish cottage souvenir. So they're like a little sort of a house on a of green, which is traditionally, I mean, quite a few cultures, definitely there's also an English cottage souvenir, or an English sort of traditional house souvenir, but the Irish cottage is one that everyone here would know. So I made 100 of them. They're just sitting in the spare room now. But yeah, so I mean, it's funny, but I mean that, it's very, I didn't feel that I had to sort of reconnect with nature, for example, in a way that a lot of people did during the lockdown, or that I had to sort of, lots of people sort of took up arts and crafts, whereas I felt that I was doing it anyway. But I suppose the things that I was doing took on a kind of a demented fervor out of sheer frustration.
I know that I need to go out every morning and look at the weather and sort of feel I know where the world is. And if I don't do that, I'm definitely, I'm out of town. Joy from Glasgow says she loves your tattoo and wonders how significant it was to you to have that on your hand.
Okay, Carlo, you'll love this because I mean, I actually have tattoos on both of them, but I think that the one that people notice is the swallow,
Yeah.
on my left hand. And I got a swallow tattoo because when I was a child, my parents' house. I mean, I write about swallows, and so they always nested at the house of my parents. And I still to this day associate the sound of them kind of chattering outside my bedroom window with home and childhood. So it was a very personal association. But after I'd had this tattooed on my hand at the age of about 18 or 19, like I was very young, a couple of years later, I learned that this was a classic prison tattoo.
Yes, it is, yes.
And particularly on the fist.
Yes.
And that a swallow on the fist is a sign of freedom. So like I've actually had people in the years since thinking that I've spent time in prison because I have this classic prison tattoo, and I had no idea, like not a clue at the age of 18.
Mary O'Donnell compliments you on being both a visual artist and a writer, and wonders if you're going to continue with both, i.e. the visual and the literary, or do you know?
Mary's so interesting because we had a sort of synchronicity, and she and I both wrote about migrant birds, or published a book that was strongly influenced by them this year. And no, I'm definitely, if anything, I'm more pursuing visual art at the moment. At the moment, I'm making a series of model container ships. Model container ships with sails, and in the new year now, and I don't really know precisely what's happening because everything is on its head with the arts especially, but I mean I'm due to have some work in an exhibition in the Glucksman Gallery in Cork. It's a gorgeous space in UCC, but also to do a residency in the National Sculpture Factory and kind of upscale these very small decorative things that I'm doing. But it's very hard, you know, I just kind of work in projects, and whatever the project is, sometimes it takes different forms. So I'm probably going to write something about it. But at the moment, I'm mainly making things. I thought that I was imagining what a container ship would look like with sails. And for a long time, I was kind of bewitched with this image. And then I was reading a book more recently that described, and then obviously I looked it up online, that this is actually something that's happening, that they're starting to make container ships that function from wind power, from sail power, and that merchant ships in general, that they're, you know, there's a movement to try and return them to the power of wind, of sail. So that's what I'm on at the moment, and I'm sure it will take multiple forms.
And during these last few months, what have you been reading?
Oh, interesting. You know, I think because summer was like so long, and it did feel like a year to like go back to classic things, or to go back to books that I felt that I'd missed, that I'd always been meaning to read. So an author I got really interested in is Patrick White. Do you know Patrick White, the Australian author? Yes, Voss. Yeah, that was like my book of the summer. I adored that, and also The Sea by Iris Murdoch, that I'd never read, and I also have that came from my granny's house, actually, Under the Net, and I'd never read East of Eden, though I've read quite a lot of Steinbeck. East of Eden was like the book I asked my mother for my birthday. So I've been actually reading classics. I mean, it wasn't actually this year, but I read. I think because I didn't study literature, I've always felt sort of behind. So this summer I felt that I would read things that would catch me up a bit. I did read Moby Dick maybe about a year ago, and I always thought that I would find it, you know, impenetrable, and I loved it. Like it was brilliant. So I've been catching up. Modern Nature I read this summer by Derek Jarman, and that was another book that was sort of that will always stick in my mind from this year, and then Chroma and a few other things afterwards. So it's funny, yeah, a lot of classics. I think it's because like now I'm reading more of my contemporaries, but because I felt completely sort of estranged from the world of literature in the last year, it kind of, it's for at first I read my contemporaries a lot, but now I'm going back again.
Yeah, that's very, very. And do you look at paintings? Do you how do you connect with the visual, with the world of art, or do you go online? Do you?
Well, you see, well, yeah, that's the problem, because I have not been in an art gallery since March. Um, and I suppose I could have been in the summer, but like I live in the middle of nowhere as well, so it's quite a big journey for me. I've had no reason to go to Dublin. Um, I did actually go to Dublin and pick up a secondhand car, but I literally just turned around and came back down again. Um, so I mean, that's more my worry, I suppose, when I go into the coming year, because if I want to show work, if I want to make work, really anyone can read books. You know, books can be disseminated. But with visual art, you need to be there in front of the object. There's only one of it. You know, you can't reproduce it and send it around. Well, I mean, you can, but you know, you can't really. You need to be in the gallery and have the experience of the art. So I kind of feel like the arts is in trouble because of that. And I miss it more than reading, obviously, because anyone can read.
Do you think that people are going to? Do you think all of this is our brains are very plastic. Do you think that we're going to start making different things, that some basic, that we are being altered, reconfigured by the experience of the last 10 months?
Do you have an answer for this?
The answer is I do. Yes, I do think we're being changed. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've noticed, for instance, is that people, when I see people in the street, they have a different shaped shoulder to the one I remember from my childhood. And it's the shoulder that comes from always being on your iPhone and walking along the road and your two thumbs going, tap, 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 tap. And that's only been a few years, and already the spine and the bone structure, I believe, is different, and the way the head is tilted and the position in the universe. And if a little physical thing like this can create that change, then locking people at home for 10 months must be changing our psyche, I believe, and making us making us more inner, I think. Yeah. Subsuming us into our unruly id is what I think it's doing.
Well, I heard a thing, I think it was on the BBC World Service, about how the school children in Madrid, because do you remember in Madrid there was a very stringent lockdown where they literally weren't allowed outside their front door, and how this, psychologists think this has possibly changed them irrevocably, or and not for the better necessarily. So yeah, I think it must be there. Like I feel so ill qualified to judge, really, because I haven't gone back out in society yet. I had very little interaction in the summer, because very little had restarted again. I literally had one meal in a restaurant, and that was it. So for me at the moment, it's all highly hypothetical. Now we're back in a lockdown, and I have no plans for anything. So I don't even know whether I can. I had one dental appointment, Carlo, that was badly needed, and and like I nearly had a panic attack, and I've never had a panic attack in my life. I smile wryly when I hear other people talk about them, because I think it's like sort of an imaginary thing. And I was sitting there in the waiting room, and there was this woman who wasn't wearing her mask correctly, and I could hear her breathing, and I literally felt like I was going to, like, my heart was going to stop. I was like, hang on, maybe this is what. So I'm worried about going back to normal. I definitely feel like it's changed me, and I'm not going to go back and be the same person that I was. And so, if that's true for me, then it's true for everyone. Then it's true for the arts.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Have you been at a restaurant or a pub?
I have. I've spent 2 nights away from home when it was allowed in Lissadell, behind Lissadell, and I have been to, I've had 2 restaurant meals. And other than that, nothing. Nothing.
Yeah. So
It's very, although I did go to
tell.
Dublin. Yes, I did go to Dublin to do an interview with somebody. But again, that was masked and all the rest of it. And that is the totality of my, that's the totality of my contact with the outside world. So mostly I tramp the lanes and go to Ashdale Vivo and buy my Guardian and my Irish Times. And I did go to the dentist, like you, much needed.
Yeah.
Because there was a window when you could get to the dentist and I wasn't going to miss my chance.
I went only recently. I went only recently and then spent the following week convinced that I'm having all the symptoms of the coronavirus.
Oh, dear me. Right. Oh, God. But you haven't.
No, I merely have an excellent filling.
Yeah, excellent. And also it's something that one doesn't want to get, the coronavirus. It's not healthy.
No, I mean even at my age, you just don't know who will get it and have these long-term effects. No. So I think I'm a hypochondriac anyway, so that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, it's the uncertainty, the ongoing uncertainty. I mean, really, I've nothing to complain about. I've an awful lot to be grateful for. But I found with the second lockdown, I've complained a lot more.
Well, for those people who are listening who might be suffering from anxiety or uncertainty, I can certainly recommend this book. It's very calming. It's a really calming read. It's very focused. It's very contained. It's very beautifully articulated. And let's not forget the other 2 novels as well. All available online from a well-known but not to be mentioned capitalist emporium. Named after Greek female warriors. And, do go there and get your book. Can I say, we've been talking for about an hour. Can I say it was wonderful to talk to you? Really, really wonderful. And I hope the gods smile. Yeah. And it's been brilliant. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carlo. Thank you for being so open and hospitable, and to the Dingle for allowing us this opportunity to have a chat, possibly in public.
Yes, indeed.